Alarms filled the control room of the Ilvanar outpost, and nobody on the Galactic Council screens reacted fast enough. Elena Hart stood near the communication terminal, her heart pounding as she watched 3 unknown ships drop out of warp near the outpost's outer ring. She had traveled to this quiet trading post as a human envoy, expecting nothing more than routine trade talks with the gentle, soft-spoken Ilvanar people. Instead, she was watching their home come under attack, and the council she had trusted to protect this region was doing nothing at all. On the council floor, hundreds of light-years away, delegates from a dozen species sat around a curved table of light, arguing about procedure. A tall, thin delegate from the Korvath system insisted that any response required a 72-hour review period. A round, silver-skinned Ilvanar representative named Doran pleaded with the council to act immediately, his voice trembling as he pointed to the live feed showing smoke rising from one of the outpost's docking bays. Nobody moved. Nobody sent help. The council simply talked, wrapped in layers of rules that had never been tested by a real crisis. Elena watched the feed from the council chamber on a small screen bolted to the wall beside her, and her hands curled into fists. She had only been on this posting for 6 months, but she had already grown fond of the Ilvanar people who ran the outpost. They had shown her their gardens, their music, their strange calm way of greeting strangers with open palms instead of words. Now their homes were burning, and the people meant to protect them were debating whether it was appropriate to intervene. A young Ilvanar technician named Vesa ran past her, clutching a wounded arm, calling out for anyone who could help move the elderly residents toward the shelter decks. Elena grabbed a nearby first aid kit without thinking, and followed him, her diplomatic training falling away as something simpler and more urgent took over. She had come here to negotiate trade routes. She never expected to be running through smoke-filled corridors, helping strangers reach safety while raiders tore through the docking bays above. The attackers were not soldiers from any recognized government. They were raiders, opportunists who had learned that quiet outposts like this one made easy targets, especially now that the council's response times had become a running joke across trade routes. They knew that by the time any official force arrived, they would already be gone with whatever they could carry. This was not the first outpost they had hit, and everyone on the council floor knew it. Yet the debate continued, delegate after delegate raising concerns about jurisdiction and consequence, as if the burning outpost could wait for their conclusions. Elena reached the shelter deck with Vesa, helping an elderly Ilvanar woman named Ambry settle into a corner, away from the main doors. Ambry's eyes were calm despite the chaos, and she reached out to squeeze Elena's hand with surprising strength. "My grandchildren are still in the Eastern Wing," she said quietly. Elena felt her stomach drop. The Eastern Wing was closest to the docking bays, closest to where the raiders had already broken through. Without a second thought, Elena turned to Vesa and asked him to keep everyone calm and organized while she went to check the Eastern Wing herself. Vesa protested, warning her that it was too dangerous, that the raiders were still active in that section. Elena did not listen. She had already made up her mind. She grabbed a handheld communicator from the wall and clipped it to her collar, then moved toward the corridor leading east, her pulse hammering in her ears. The corridor was dim, lit only by emergency lights that pulsed a dull orange. Elena could hear distant shouting, the clatter of metal, and something that sounded like heavy crates being dragged across a floor. She pressed herself against the wall and moved carefully, trying to remember the layout of the outpost from the tour she had taken during her first week. The Eastern Wing housed a small school, where Ilvanar children learned language and music in bright, open rooms. She prayed the raiders had not reached it yet. As she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with 2 young Ilvanar children, huddled behind an overturned cart. They stared up at her with wide, frightened eyes, unsure whether she was a threat or a rescuer. Elena crouched down slowly and spoke in the gentle, careful tone she had learned from months of practicing the Ilvanar greeting customs. She told them her name and asked for theirs. The older child, a boy who could not have been more than 8 years old, whispered that his name was Tamsil, and that his sister beside him was called Ori. Their grandmother was Ambry, waiting for them on the shelter deck. Relief washed over Elena, quickly followed by fresh fear as she heard footsteps approaching from further down the corridor. She pulled the 2 children behind the cart and pressed a finger to her lips. The footsteps grew louder, heavy and deliberate. Nothing like the light steps of Ilvanar's staff. Elena's mind raced. She had no weapon, no training in combat, nothing but her wits, and a growing determination that these children would not be harmed while she was standing there. She reached for the communicator on her collar, and, keeping her voice as quiet as possible, sent an emergency signal to the only channel she trusted completely. It was not a council channel. It was a private frequency, belonging to a human peacekeeping vessel stationed nearby, one she had exchanged greetings with only once, during a routine patrol check weeks earlier. She had saved the frequency out of simple politeness, never imagining she would need it for anything urgent. On the other end of that frequency, aboard the vessel known as the Horizon Wake, a communications officer named Priya Nair sat up straight as the emergency signal chimed through her console. She had been monitoring the outpost situation from a distance, frustrated by the council's inaction, when the direct message came through. It was Elena's voice, tense and hushed, describing raiders in the eastern wing, 2 children hiding, and no help coming from the council at all. Priya did not hesitate. She turned to the ship's captain, a steady, broad-shouldered man named Daniel Cole, who had been standing near the main viewport with his arms crossed, watching the distant outpost through a long-range scanner. Priya relayed the message word for word, watching Daniel's expression shift from calm concentration to sharp focus. He asked only one question. "Is the envoy still in danger?" Priya confirmed that she was. Daniel turned to his crew and gave the order to move. There was no council authorization, no formal request through proper channels, only a distress call from a person in danger, and an old but deeply held human belief that no call for help should ever go unanswered. The Horizon Wake, which the council had always assumed to be a lightly equipped ceremonial vessel, meant mostly for escort duties, came alive with a kind of purposeful energy that none of the other species stationed nearby had ever witnessed firsthand. Meanwhile, back in the corridor, Elena kept her arms around Tamsil and Ori, listening as the heavy footsteps grew closer. She could see a shadow stretching across the floor from around the corner, long and broad, moving with the slow confidence of someone who believed there was nothing left to fear on this outpost. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She glanced down at the 2 children, both trembling silently, and made a decision. If the raider rounded that corner, she would stand between him and the children, no matter what happened next. The shadow paused. For a long, terrible moment, nothing moved. Then the footsteps turned away, heading toward another section of the wing, drawn perhaps by a noise or a signal from elsewhere in the outpost. Elena let out a shaking breath she did not realize she had been holding. She waited another full minute before daring to move, then gently guided the 2 children back toward the shelter deck, taking the long way around to avoid the corridor where the raider had been. They reached the shelter deck just as Ambry spotted them from across the room. The elderly woman rushed forward as quickly as her legs allowed, gathering Tamsil and Ori into her arms with a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh of relief. Elena stood back, watching the reunion, her legs finally giving in to the adrenaline that had carried her through the last 20 minutes. Vesa appeared at her side, offering a hand to steady her, his expression full of gratitude and disbelief. Above the outpost, the raiders continued their assault on the docking bays, unaware that a response was already on its way, one that none of the council delegates arguing endlessly on their floating screens had authorized or expected. The council still debated. Doran, the Ilvanar representative, had grown hoarse from pleading, his silver skin dulled with exhaustion and fear for his people. The delegate from Korvath continued insisting on proper procedure, unmoved by the footage of smoke and fire playing on the screens behind him. Then, quietly at first, one of the monitoring officers on the council floor noticed something unusual on the long-range sensors near the outpost. A single vessel, moving at a speed that made no sense according to any known classification for its type, had broken away from its assigned patrol route. The officer blinked at the readout, certain it was some kind of error. The vessel's registered designation matched the Horizon Wake, a ship the council had catalogued as a modest human escort craft with limited capability, meant only for ceremonial patrols along quiet trade lanes. The officer raised the alert quietly, unsure if it even mattered enough to interrupt the ongoing debate. Within moments, though, more sensors picked up the same anomaly, and murmurs began to spread across the council floor. Something was approaching the outpost far faster than protocol allowed. faster than most of the delegates believed was even possible for a vessel of that classification. Doran turned toward the screen showing the sensor data, his exhaustion replaced instantly by a flicker of hope he barely dared to feel. Elena, still on the shelter deck comforting frightened residents, felt the communicator on her collar vibrate. She lifted it to her ear and heard Priya's voice, steady and reassuring, informing her that help was close, closer than she could imagine, and that she needed to keep everyone calm and away from the docking bays until further notice. Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, relief flooding through her exhausted body, before she turned back to the frightened faces around her and did exactly what Priya asked, offering calm words and steady hands to those who needed them most. Outside, in the black expanse of space surrounding the outpost, the horizon wake grew from a distant point of light into a visible shape, moving with a precision and speed that seemed to defy the very classification the Council had assigned to it. The raiders' ships, still busy stripping cargo from the docking bays, had no idea that everything about their plan was about to change in ways they could not have predicted. And on the Council floor, delegates who moments earlier had been arguing about 72-hour review periods now sat in stunned silence, watching a species they had always considered emotional, unpredictable, and fundamentally harmless, prepare to show them something entirely different. Doran leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly on the edge of the console, and whispered a single word that seemed to capture the mood of the entire chamber. Finally, nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. Every eye on the Council floor remained fixed on the sensor readout, watching the small, fast-moving shape draw closer to the outpost with each passing second, carrying with it the first real response this crisis had received since it began. Elena, unaware of the shift happening across the galaxy's political landscape in that very moment, simply held Ori's small hand and waited, trusting that the help she had called for would arrive in time, and hoping deeply that it would be enough to end this nightmare before anyone else got hurt. The horizon wake closed the distance to the outpost faster than any sensor on the Council floor had predicted, and Captain Daniel Cole stood at the center of his bridge with a calm focus that seemed almost out of place given the speed of everything happening around him. His crew moved through their stations with practiced ease, each person aware of exactly what their role required, none of them wasting time on questions about authorization or procedure. This was not their first crisis, and they had trained for moments exactly like this one, even though the Council had never expected them to. Priya kept the communication line open with Elena, relaying updates in short, clear bursts, so the young ambassador would know exactly what to expect. She told Elena that the ship would arrive within minutes, that the crew's priority was clearing the docking bays and protecting the civilians first, and that Elena needed to keep everyone away from open corridors until the situation stabilized. Elena acknowledged the instructions and passed the message along to Vesa, who began organizing the shelter deck with a renewed sense of purpose, moving residents further from the exits and toward the reinforced inner rooms. On the Council floor, the mood had shifted entirely. Delegates who had spent the last half-hour debating procedure now watched in near silence as the sensor readouts continued updating, showing the human vessel closing in on the outpost at a velocity that several engineering officers openly questioned as impossible for its registered class. A Korvath delegate, the same one who had insisted on a 72-hour review period, leaned toward a colleague and asked quietly whether the ship's classification records had been entered incorrectly. Nobody had an answer for him. Doran, the Ilvanar representative, allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope, though years of council meetings had taught him not to celebrate too early. He watched the screen with his hands clasped tightly together, silently praying that this new development would not simply add another layer of delay to an already unbearable weight. He did not yet understand what he was about to witness, and neither did anyone else in that chamber, human included. Aboard the Horizon Wake, Daniel received a final scan of the outpost's docking bays from his tactical officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace Whitfield, who had served with him for nearly 6 years. Grace reported 3 raider vessels still docked, along with several smaller shuttlecraft moving cargo between the outpost and the larger ships. She noted that the raiders showed no signs of retreating, likely because they had grown used to council response times that gave them hours, sometimes days, of uninterrupted opportunity. They had no idea that this time would be different. Daniel studied the layout on his display, mapping out the fastest and safest approach to disable the raider vessels without risking further harm to the outpost or its residents. He had led enough operations to know that speed and precision mattered more than raw force, and that the goal here was not punishment but protection. He gave a series of quick, clear orders, directing his pilot, a steady young man named Oliver Bright, to bring the ship in along the outpost's northern approach, using the structure itself as partial cover from the raiders' scanners. Oliver executed the maneuver with practiced skill, weaving the horizon wake through a narrow debris field left over from an old mining operation, using the scattered rock formations to mask their approach until the very last possible moment. The raiders, confident and unhurried, had no warning until the human vessel emerged from the debris field directly above their docked ships, close enough that visual contact was made before any alarm could be raised. For a brief moment, everything on the outpost's docking level seemed to freeze, both sides caught in a heartbeat of realization. Grace's voice cut through the bridge, calm and precise, confirming weapons systems ready and shields at full strength. Daniel gave the order to disable, not destroy, prioritizing the safety of the outpost above all else. The Horizon Wake's defensive systems activated with a controlled burst of energy that swept across the nearest raider vessel's engine section, cutting its mobility instantly without breaching the hull or endangering anyone aboard. The raider ship lurched violently, its lights flickering as its systems struggled to compensate for the sudden loss of propulsion. Inside the docking bay itself, the raiders who had been loading stolen cargo froze at the sound of the disturbance above them, exchanging confused glances before scrambling toward whatever cover they could find. One of their leaders, a broad-shouldered man with a scarred jaw named Corin Vale, shouted orders that nobody seemed eager to follow, his authority crumbling as the situation spiraled beyond anything he had planned for. He had led raids on a dozen outposts without ever encountering resistance beyond a handful of underpaid security guards. This was something else entirely. Elena, still on the shelter deck, felt the outpost shudder faintly beneath her feet as the first disabling strike hit the raider ship above. She exchanged a worried glance with Vesa, both of them unsure what the tremor meant, until Priya's voice came through the communicator again, calm and reassuring, explaining that the human vessel had arrived and was actively working to secure the docking bays. Elena felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees, though she forced herself to remain steady for the sake of the frightened residents around her. On the council floor, the sensor feeds now showed a clear visual of the confrontation, and the chamber fell into a stunned hush. Delegates who moments earlier had debated abstract procedure now watched real footage of the Horizon Wake methodically neutralizing the raider vessels one by one, each maneuver executed with a precision that seemed almost effortless. The Korvath delegate who had pushed so hard for delay sat back in his seat, his expression unreadable, while Doran leaned forward so intently that his hands pressed flat against the console in front of him. Daniel's crew continued their work with the same focused calm that had defined the entire operation, disabling the second raider vessel's weapons array before it could even power up fully. Grace reported that the third vessel, likely commanded by Corin Vale himself, was attempting to retreat rather than fight, cutting its docking clamps and preparing for an emergency departure. Daniel studied the trajectory data for a moment, weighing the risk of letting the raiders escape to strike another outpost in the future, against the priority of protecting the people still on board this one. He made his decision quickly. "Grace, target their propulsion only," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Do not let them regroup for another attempt on this outpost, or anywhere else along this trade route." Grace acknowledged the order and adjusted her targeting systems, tracking the fleeing vessel's engine signature with careful precision. The Horizon Wake surged forward, closing the gap with a burst of speed that caught even Corin Vale's experienced pilot off guard. Inside the fleeing raider ship, alarms blared as the crew realized their escape route was not as clear as they had hoped. Corin barked orders at his pilot, demanding evasive maneuvers, but the ship's aging systems struggled to keep pace with the smaller, faster vessel now pursuing them through the debris field. The chase wound through scattered rock formations and abandoned mining equipment, each turn narrowing the raiders' options further, until finally, Grace's targeting lock found its mark, and a precise strike disabled the fleeing ship's main engines without breaching its hull. The raider vessel drifted to a slow, powerless stop amid the debris, its lights dimming as backup systems struggled to compensate for the sudden loss of primary power. Daniel ordered a boarding team to prepare, wanting to ensure the raiders were fully contained and unable to cause further harm before local security forces could arrive to take formal custody. He selected a small team led by a steady, level-headed officer named Marcus Bell, who had trained extensively for exactly this kind of operation, prioritizing careful control over unnecessary confrontation. Marcus and his team moved through the disabled raider vessel with practiced efficiency, securing each section methodically, ensuring that Corin Vale and his remaining crew members were unable to cause any further trouble. There was no dramatic struggle, no chaos, only a quiet, controlled process that left the raiders with no options remaining. Corin, realizing the futility of resistance, allowed himself to be secured without incident, his earlier confidence replaced by a grim, silent acceptance of the situation he now found himself in. Back on the outpost, Elena received word from Priya that the docking bays were fully secured and that the immediate danger had passed. She allowed herself a long, shaking breath, then turned to share the news with Vesa and the residents around her. A ripple of relief spread through the shelter deck, quiet at first, then growing into soft murmurs of gratitude and disbelief as the reality of their rescue began to sink in. Ambry pulled Tamsil and Ori closer, pressing gentle kisses to the tops of their heads, her eyes shining with tears she no longer needed to hold back. On the council floor, the chamber remained silent for a long moment after the final confirmation came through that all 3 raider vessels had been neutralized, without significant harm to the outpost or its residents. Doran finally allowed himself to lean back in his seat, his relief so overwhelming that he needed a moment before he could speak. When he finally did, his voice carried across the chamber with quiet gratitude, thanking whoever had responded so swiftly when the council itself had failed to act. Several delegates exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsettled by what they had just witnessed. The efficiency, the speed, the calm precision with which the human vessel had handled a threat that the council had spent hours debating without resolution left many of them reconsidering everything they thought they understood about this relatively new member species. A quiet murmur spread through the chamber as delegates began pulling up records, searching for information about human military history, human psychology, anything that might explain what they had just seen unfold before their eyes. The Korvath delegate, still visibly shaken, turned to a nearby colleague and asked a question that seemed to hang in the air long after he spoke it. If this is what they do, when following their own instincts, without our approval, what exactly have we been allowing to remain hidden behind their calm diplomatic behavior all this time? Nobody offered an answer, because nobody truly knew, and for the first time since humanity had joined the council, a real sense of uncertainty began to settle over the chamber, mixed with something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. Aboard the Horizon Wake, Marcus Bell finished securing the last of the raider crew members, walking through the disabled vessel one final time to confirm that no further threat remained. He found the ship's cargo hold packed with stolen goods, food supplies, medical equipment, and small mechanical parts clearly taken from the outpost's storage facilities during the earlier stages of the attack. He photographed everything carefully, knowing the evidence would matter later when the regional security force finally arrived to take formal custody of the prisoners and begin the slow process of returning stolen property to its rightful owners. Corin Vale sat quietly in a holding area near the rear of his own ship, guarded by 2 of Marcus's team members, his earlier bravado completely gone. He watched the humans move through his vessel with a kind of grim fascination, noting how differently they carried themselves compared to the raiders he usually recruited for these operations. There was no cruelty in how they treated him or his crew, only a firm, businesslike efficiency that left no room for negotiation or escape, yet also no unnecessary harshness beyond what the situation required. Grace Whitfield remained on the bridge of the Horizon Wake throughout this process, coordinating with Daniel to ensure the outpost's remaining systems were stable and that no additional threats lingered nearby. She ran a final sweep of the surrounding debris field, confirming that no other raider vessels had been lying in wait, ready to exploit any confusion following the main engagement. Her scans came back clear, and she reported the news to Daniel with visible relief, having spent the last hour quietly worried about the possibility of a second wave arriving before reinforcements could reach the outpost. Daniel acknowledged her report and turned his attention to the outpost itself, requesting an update on the condition of the docking bays and the extent of the damage caused during the raid. Priya relayed information from the outpost's own maintenance crews, explaining that while several sections had suffered serious damage, the structural integrity of the outpost remained sound, and repairs could begin almost immediately now that the threat had been removed. Daniel felt a measure of satisfaction at the news, understanding that swift action had likely prevented what could have become a far more devastating outcome for the people living there. As the hours passed, a modest regional security vessel finally arrived, considerably later than anyone would have liked, carrying a small team tasked with formally processing the captured raiders and beginning an official investigation into the attack. The security officer in charge, a weary-looking official named Halden Ives, seemed almost embarrassed by the delay, offering a quiet apology to Daniel as his team began transferring Corin Vale and the rest of his crew into proper custody. Daniel accepted the apology graciously, understanding that the fault lay not with Halden personally, but with a broader system that had proven far too slow when speed mattered most. Elena watched from a distance as the security vessel completed its work, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. The crisis had passed, and the outpost had survived largely intact, but she could not shake the awareness of just how close things had come to a far worse outcome, and how entirely that outcome had depended on her decision to reach out to a ship the Council itself had never properly authorized to respond. She wondered, not for the first time, what might have happened if she had hesitated, or if the Horizon Wake had been assigned to a different, more distant patrol route that day. Vesa found her standing near the edge of the shelter deck, lost in thought, and gently asked if she was all right. Elena offered him a tired smile, admitting that the weight of everything that had happened was only now beginning to settle over her. Vesa nodded with quiet understanding, having spent years working at the outpost and having witnessed more than his share of difficult moments, though none quite like this one. He told her simply that the outpost would remember her actions for a very long time, and that gratitude, in his experience, tended to outlast fear far more often than people expected. Within hours, news of the rescue spread far beyond the outpost and the council chamber, carried through trade routes and communication relays, until it reached nearly every corner of known space. Traders who had grown used to hearing about raider attacks with no real consequences now spoke of a different outcome, one where help had arrived swiftly and decisively, ending the threat before it could spiral into tragedy. For the people who lived and worked along these quiet trade lanes, the story felt like something close to a miracle, a rare moment where the system meant to protect them had actually worked, even if not through the channel anyone expected. Elena remained on the outpost for 2 more days, helping coordinate the return to normal operations alongside Vesa and the rest of the Ilvanar staff. She spent much of her time with Ambry, Tamsil, and Ori, checking in on them as the outpost slowly began repairing the damage left behind by the attack. Ambry insisted on preparing a meal for Elena on the final evening before her departure, a quiet gesture of gratitude that meant more to Elena than any formal recognition the council might eventually offer. Over the meal, Ambry spoke softly about her years living on the outpost, her hopes for her grandchildren's future, and her quiet relief that this future remained possible because help had come when it was needed most. Meanwhile, aboard the Horizon Wake, Daniel and his crew handled the aftermath of the operation with the same steady professionalism that had defined the rescue itself. Corin Vale and his surviving crew members were transferred into the custody of a regional security force that arrived nearly a full day after the incident had already been resolved, a delay that did not go unnoticed by anyone monitoring the situation from the council floor. Grace filed a detailed report documenting every decision made during the engagement, careful to record the minimal force used and the clear priority placed on protecting civilian lives throughout the entire operation. Daniel found himself reflecting quietly on the events of the past 2 days as he stood near the observation window of his ship, watching the outpost grow smaller in the distance as they prepared to resume their assigned patrol route. He had not acted out of any desire to prove a point to the council or to any other species watching from a distance. He had simply responded to someone in danger, the same way he had been trained to respond his entire career, the same way generations of humans before him had responded when someone called for help. It struck him as strange that this simple, straightforward instinct had apparently unsettled an entire chamber of experienced diplomats. Back on the council floor, the aftermath of the incident had triggered a wave of activity unlike anything seen since humanity's initial admission to the council a decade earlier. Delegates from dozens of member species requested access to historical records about human behavior, human conflict, and human capability, eager to understand exactly what they had witnessed during the rescue operation. Researchers within the Council's Information Division worked around the clock, compiling reports that attempted to explain the psychological and evolutionary background behind what had unfolded, though many of these reports raised more questions than they answered. One particular researcher, a methodical and soft-spoken Korvath scholar named Phelan Rowe, became especially fascinated by the topic, spending days poring over declassified human historical archives that had been shared with the Council years earlier, but largely ignored due to their unsettling content. Phelan discovered patterns that startled her, records of humanity's long evolutionary history, as both hunted prey and skilled hunter, a species shaped by countless generations of survival pressure that had forged instincts far more complex and adaptable than the Council had ever fully appreciated. She began compiling her findings into a report that she intended to present at the next full council session, uncertain how her colleagues would react to what she had uncovered. Doran, still processing the relief of his people's safety, found himself drawn into countless conversations with delegates, eager to understand more about the species that had saved his outpost. He answered their questions honestly, sharing his own observations of Elena's calm courage during the crisis, the way she had personally guided his grandchildren to safety, without any hesitation, despite the obvious danger to herself. He spoke of this not as evidence of some frightening hidden capability, but as proof of something deeper and more admirable, a willingness to act selflessly for the sake of others regardless of personal risk. Not everyone on the council shared Doran's perspective. A faction of delegates, led quietly by a cautious and calculating representative from the Halvex cluster named Prime Delegate Sorn, began pushing for closer scrutiny of human military capability across the entire alliance. Sorn argued in private meetings that a species capable of such swift and effective action, without waiting for proper authorization, represented a potential risk to the delicate balance of power the Council had worked so hard to maintain over the centuries. He suggested that stricter oversight measures might be necessary, framing his concerns not as hostility toward humanity, but as simple prudence given what had just been demonstrated. Word of these private discussions eventually reached the human delegation stationed at Council headquarters, a small team led by an experienced diplomat named Grace Fenwick, unrelated to the tactical officer aboard the Horizon Wake despite the shared name. Grace Fenwick had represented humanity at the Council for nearly 3 years, navigating the complex political landscape with patience and careful diplomacy. She was not surprised by Sorn's concerns, having anticipated some degree of unease following such a visible demonstration of human capability, but she remained calm, understanding that transparency and honest dialogue would serve humanity far better than defensiveness or denial. Grace requested a formal meeting with Sorn and several other concerned delegates, hoping to address their fears directly before misinformation and speculation could spread further. She reached out to Daniel and Elena as well, asking both of them to prepare to speak honestly about their experiences during the rescue operation, believing that first-hand accounts would carry far more weight than any official statement crafted by the diplomatic corps. Elena agreed readily, still processing her own complicated feelings about the events on the outpost, while Daniel accepted the request with the same quiet professionalism he brought to every aspect of his duties. In the days leading up to the meeting, Phelan Rowe continued her research, growing increasingly convinced that the Council's long-standing assumptions about humanity needed serious reconsideration. She discovered records describing humanity's complicated history of conflict among themselves, but also countless examples of extraordinary cooperation, sacrifice, and protection extended toward strangers in times of crisis. The pattern that emerged from her research was not one of simple aggression, but something far more nuanced. A species whose capacity for fierce action existed alongside an equally powerful capacity for compassion and connection. She shared her preliminary findings with Doran, who listened intently, nodding along as she described the evolutionary pressures that had shaped human behavior over countless generations. Doran found himself thinking of Elena again, of the calm determination in her voice when she had guided his grandchildren through smoke-filled corridors, and of Daniel's crew, who had risked everything to answer a distress call that fell entirely outside their assigned duties. He began to understand that what the Council had witnessed was not some hidden threat finally revealing itself, but rather a demonstration of exactly the kind of protective instinct that made humanity valuable as an ally. Meanwhile, aboard the Horizon Wake, Daniel received a formal request to attend the upcoming council meeting alongside Elena and Grace Fenwick. He accepted without hesitation, though he felt a familiar reluctance at the idea of standing before a room full of delegates to explain actions that had felt, to him, entirely straightforward and necessary. He gathered his senior officers, including Grace Whitfield, Priya, Oliver, and Marcus, to discuss how best to present their account of the operation, wanting to ensure the council understood exactly what had happened and why, without unnecessary embellishment or defensiveness. Priya suggested that honesty would serve them best, recommending that Daniel simply describe the sequence of events exactly as they occurred, trusting that the truth would speak clearly enough on its own. Grace Whitfield agreed, adding that the council's own sensor logs already documented the operation in precise detail, leaving little room for misinterpretation, beyond whatever fears the delegates brought with them into the meeting. Daniel appreciated their input, feeling grateful for a crew whose steady judgment matched his own instincts so closely, a bond forged through years of shared service and mutual trust. As the day of the meeting approached, Elena found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since that first alarm sounded on the outpost. She thought of Tamsil and Ori, safe now with their grandmother, of Vasa's quiet strength throughout the crisis, and of the strange, sudden shift in how the other species around her now seemed to regard humanity. She did not feel like someone who had unleashed some frightening hidden capability. She felt like someone who had simply done what needed to be done for people she had come to care about deeply during her time on the outpost. Grace Fenwick met with Elena privately before the meeting, offering guidance on how to present her experience to the council without becoming overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. She reminded Elena that her actions had saved lives, that nothing about her behavior during the crisis warranted defensiveness or apology, and that the council's fear stemmed not from anything wrong that humanity had done, but from a lack of understanding about what humanity truly was. Elena absorbed this guidance carefully, feeling a renewed sense of confidence settle over her as the meeting drew closer. On the morning of the council session, Phelan Rowe finalized her research report, adding a final section that summarized her overall conclusions in careful, measured language. She wrote that humanity's capacity for swift, decisive action in moments of crisis appeared deeply intertwined with an equally strong instinct toward protection and self-sacrifice, particularly when defending those unable to protect themselves. She noted that this combination, rather than representing a threat to the Council's stability, might instead represent one of humanity's greatest potential contributions to the Alliance, provided the Council approached the relationship with understanding rather than fear. As delegates began filing into the council chamber for the emergency session, murmurs of anticipation filled the air, a stark contrast to the routine indifference that had characterized so many previous meetings. Doran took his seat near the front of the chamber, glancing toward the entrance where he knew Elena, Daniel, and Grace Fenwick would soon arrive to address the assembly. Soren sat further back, his expression unreadable, still convinced that caution remained the wisest path forward, despite the growing tide of admiration spreading through the chamber following news of the rescue. Phelan took her place among the council's research delegation, her report clutched carefully in hand, ready to present findings that she hoped would reshape the conversation entirely. She glanced toward Doran, who offered her a small, encouraging nod, both of them sensing that this meeting represented something far more significant than a simple review of a single rescue operation. It felt, to both of them, like the beginning of an entirely new chapter in humanity's relationship with the wider galactic community. One built not on assumption and fear, but on genuine understanding, forged through a moment of undeniable courage. The chamber doors opened, and a hushed silence fell over the assembled delegates as Elena, Daniel, and Grace Fenwick entered together, walking toward the center platform, where they would soon share their account of everything that had transpired. Elena caught Doran's eye across the chamber and offered a small, grateful smile, which he returned warmly. Daniel walked with the same calm, steady presence that had defined his actions throughout the entire crisis, betraying no hint of nervousness, despite the weight of so many eyes now fixed upon him. The meeting that would reshape the Council's understanding of humanity was about to begin. In the days before the session, news of the rescue had also reached independent journalists, who covered galactic affairs for audiences across dozens of member worlds. A well-known correspondent named Illyra Voss, no relation to Elena despite the shared surname, traveled to the outpost personally to interview residents and gather first-hand accounts of what had happened. She spoke with Vesa, with several outpost workers who had witnessed the rescue unfold, and eventually with Ambry herself, who welcomed the correspondent into her home with the same warmth she had shown Elena during the crisis. Ambry spoke candidly about her fear during the attack, and her overwhelming relief when Elena appeared with Tamsil and Ori safely in tow. She described the sound of the Horizon Wake arriving, a sound she said she would never forget for as long as she lived, comparing it to the feeling of a held breath finally being released after what felt like an eternity of waiting. Illyra recorded every word carefully, sensing that this story carried significance far beyond a simple account of a foiled raid, touching instead on deeper questions about trust, capability, and what it truly meant to protect one another across a diverse and sometimes fractured alliance. Her resulting report spread quickly across major information networks, reaching audiences who had never given much thought to humanity's role within the Council before. Public reaction proved overwhelmingly sympathetic, with many ordinary citizens across member worlds expressing admiration for the courage shown by both Elena and the crew of the Horizon Wake. This groundswell of public sentiment did not go unnoticed by the delegates preparing for the emergency council session, many of whom found themselves reconsidering their positions in light of how strongly their own constituencies had responded to the story. Sorn, aware of this shifting public mood, found himself in a difficult position as he prepared his own remarks for the upcoming session. He remained genuinely concerned about the long-term implications of humanity's demonstrated capability, but he also recognized that dismissing the rescue as a mere security risk, without acknowledging the genuine heroism involved, would likely alienate the very constituents he represented. He spent long hours revising his planned statement, searching for language that could express legitimate caution without diminishing the very real courage that had saved so many lives. Phelan Rowe, meanwhile, continued refining her research report late into the night before the session, cross-referencing her findings against additional historical records she had only recently gained access to through the Council's archives. She discovered further examples throughout human history of ordinary people responding to emergencies with remarkable selflessness, patterns that reinforced her growing conviction that the events at the outpost reflected something deeply characteristic of the species, rather than an isolated, unpredictable incident. She hoped her presentation would help shift the Council's perspective from one of cautious suspicion toward one of genuine partnership built on mutual understanding. Doran spent his final hours before the session speaking quietly with Tamsil and Ori, who had insisted on recording a short message for him to share with the Council, expressing their own gratitude toward Elena and the crew who had saved them. Doran promised to share their message if the opportunity arose, moved by his grandchildren's earnest desire to contribute something meaningful to a conversation they were still too young to fully understand. He tucked the small recording device carefully into his robes, determined to let their innocent voices remind the Council of exactly what had been at stake during those frightening hours. Grace Fenwick stepped forward first, addressing the chamber with the calm, practiced tone of a diplomat who had spent years navigating exactly this kind of delicate moment. She thanked the Council for the opportunity to speak, then introduced Elena and Daniel, explaining briefly that both had played central roles in the events surrounding the rescue of the Ilvanar outpost. She made clear that neither of them had come to defend humanity against accusation, but simply to share an honest account of what had happened, allowing the Council to draw its own conclusions based on truth, rather than speculation. Elena spoke first, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter she felt beneath her calm exterior. She described the moment the attack began, the Council's prolonged debate while the outpost burned, and her own decision to reach out directly to the Horizon Wake when no other help seemed forthcoming. She spoke of Tamsil and Ori, of guiding them safely through smoke-filled corridors, and of the quiet terror she had felt believing, even briefly, that she might not be able to protect them. She did not exaggerate or dramatize her account, simply stating the facts plainly, allowing the weight of the experience to speak for itself. Several delegates listened with visible emotion as Elena continued, particularly when she described Ambry's gratitude, the quiet dinner shared on her final evening at the outpost, and the deep sense of connection she had formed with people she had known for only a matter of months. She explained that her decision to contact the Horizon Wake had not come from any calculated strategy, but from a simple, immediate need to protect children who were in danger, a need that overrode every consideration of procedure or protocol in that moment. When Elena finished, Daniel stepped forward to share his own account, describing the distress signal his crew received, the decision to respond immediately without waiting for council authorization, and the careful, deliberate approach his team had taken to neutralize the threat while minimizing harm to everyone involved. He spoke plainly about the operation itself, avoiding embellishment, focusing instead on the specific choices made at each stage, choices guided consistently by the priority of protecting civilian lives above all else. He addressed the question that he knew lingered in many delegates' minds, directly, acknowledging that his ship's capabilities exceeded what the Council had understood them to be. He explained honestly that human vessels serving in peacekeeping roles were equipped for a wide range of scenarios, not out of any intention to deceive the Council, but because human military doctrine had long emphasized preparedness for unpredictable circumstances, a lesson learned through humanity's own complicated history of conflict and survival. Sorn rose from his seat, his expression carefully neutral, and asked the question that many in the chamber had been waiting to hear voiced aloud. He asked Daniel directly what would prevent this same capability from being turned toward less noble purposes in the future, given that humanity had demonstrated a willingness to act decisively and without hesitation outside the bounds of council authorization. The chamber fell silent, waiting for Daniel's response. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that his words in this moment carried significant weight for how humanity would be perceived moving forward. He explained that human history was indeed marked by periods of conflict, struggle, and difficult choices, a history no reasonable person would attempt to minimize or hide. But he pointed out that this same history had also produced a deeply held cultural value around protecting the vulnerable, a value reflected in the very doctrine that had guided his response to Elena's distress call in the first place. He reminded the chamber that his crew had prioritized disabling the raiders rather than causing unnecessary harm, that they had shown restraint even when pursuing the fleeing vessel, targeting only what was necessary to prevent further danger, rather than seeking any additional escalation. He suggested that trust, much like the Council's own alliance, could not be built through fear or suspicion, but only through consistent demonstration of shared values over time, and he expressed his hope that humanity's actions during this crisis represented exactly that kind of demonstration. Phelan Rowe rose next, requesting permission to present her research findings to the Assembly. Grace Fenwick nodded encouragingly, and Phelan stepped forward, her report clutched steadily in hand, despite the nervous energy she felt standing before such a large gathering. She spoke carefully, summarizing her research into humanity's evolutionary and historical background, explaining the complex interplay between conflict and cooperation that had shaped the species over countless generations. She described how humanity's long history, as both hunter and hunted, had forged instincts capable of remarkable adaptability, instincts that could manifest as fierce protection in moments of crisis, but which existed alongside an equally powerful capacity for empathy, cooperation, and self-sacrifice. She emphasized that the events at the Ilvanar outpost reflected this duality perfectly, a swift and decisive response, driven not by aggression for its own sake, but by a deep, almost instinctive commitment to protecting those in danger. Doran rose to speak as well, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed the crisis firsthand. He described Elena's courage in guiding his grandchildren to safety, and the relief and gratitude felt by every resident of the outpost when the Horizon Wake arrived. He addressed Sorn's concerns directly, acknowledging that caution was understandable given the unfamiliar nature of what the Council had witnessed, but he urged the chamber to consider the outcome of that day, rather than focusing solely on hypothetical fears about the future. He reminded the Council that had humanity not acted, the outpost might have suffered far greater losses, and that the Council's own delay had nearly resulted in tragedy before any response arrived at all. He suggested that rather than viewing humanity's capability with suspicion, the Council might instead consider how such capability, guided by the values Daniel and Elena had both demonstrated, could serve as a valuable asset in protecting vulnerable member worlds across the Alliance moving forward. The chamber fell into a long, contemplative silence following Doran's remarks, delegates exchanging glances as they weighed everything they had heard against their own preconceptions about humanity. Sorn remained seated, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive, clearly processing the arguments presented before him. He was not a delegate prone to hasty judgment, and Grace Fenwick could see in his careful consideration a genuine willingness to reassess his position based on the evidence before him. A representative from a species called the Merilith, who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke up, asking Daniel a pointed question about how humanity would respond if the Council formally requested a partnership arrangement for defense purposes, rather than relying on unauthorized action during future crises. Daniel answered honestly, explaining that his crew would welcome clearer channels for rapid response, provided such channels did not sacrifice the speed and flexibility necessary to protect lives in genuine emergencies. Grace Fenwick added that the human delegation would welcome the opportunity to formalize humanity's role within the Council's broader defense framework, suggesting that structured cooperation would serve everyone's interests far better than the current system, which had proven dangerously slow during the recent crisis. She proposed the creation of a joint committee, combining human capability with the Council's broader diplomatic authority, ensuring that future emergencies could be met with both speed and proper oversight. The proposal generated immediate interest across the chamber, with several delegates nodding thoughtfully as they considered the practical benefits of such an arrangement. Even Sorn, still cautious, acknowledged that a formalized structure might address his concerns about unchecked capability, while still preserving the swift response that had proven so valuable during the recent crisis. He requested time to review the proposal in detail before committing to any formal position, a request Grace Fenwick readily granted, understanding that meaningful change required careful consideration rather than hasty decisions. As the session drew toward its conclusion, Doran approached Elena and Daniel privately, expressing his personal gratitude once more, along with an invitation for both of them to visit the outpost again in the future, not as diplomats managing a crisis, but as honored guests welcomed back to a community that would never forget what they had done. Elena accepted warmly, already looking forward to seeing Tamsil and Ori again, under far calmer circumstances, while Daniel offered a quiet, genuine thank you, touched by the sincerity of Doran's gesture. Phelan lingered near the platform after the session ended, watching the delegates slowly file out of the chamber, many of them still deep in conversation about everything they had witnessed and heard. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that her research had contributed meaningfully to a shift in understanding that could reshape humanity's relationship with the Council for years to come. She approached Elena and Daniel briefly before they departed, thanking them both for their honesty and courage in sharing their experiences so openly with the Assembly. Grace Fenwick remained behind as well, already beginning to draft the framework for the proposed Joint Defense Committee, recognizing that the coming weeks would require careful negotiation to translate the Chamber's newfound goodwill into a lasting, practical arrangement. She felt cautiously optimistic, aware that trust built in a single dramatic moment could easily fade without consistent follow-through, but hopeful that the foundation laid during this session represented a genuine turning point rather than a fleeting reaction to a single crisis. As Elena and Daniel made their way back toward the transport that would return them to their respective postings, they walked together in comfortable silence for a while, both reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that first alarm sounded on the outpost. Elena finally spoke, admitting that she had never expected her routine diplomatic posting to lead to a moment that reshaped an entire council's understanding of humanity. Daniel offered a small, thoughtful smile, replying that perhaps the most meaningful moments rarely announce themselves in advance, arriving instead in the middle of ordinary days, demanding nothing more than an honest, immediate response to whoever needed help the most. Before the session had fully concluded, Doran requested one final moment before the assembly, asking permission to share something he believed the council needed to hear. Grace Fenwick nodded her approval, and Doran stepped forward, producing the small recording device Tamsil and Ori had given him earlier that day. He explained to the chamber that he wished to share the voices of two children who had lived through the crisis firsthand, believing their simple words might convey something that formal testimony could not fully capture. He activated the recording, and the chamber fell completely silent as two small, earnest voices filled the room. Tamsel spoke first, his voice slightly shaky but determined, thanking the humans who had saved his sister and himself, describing how frightened he had been, and how relieved he felt when Elena found them hiding behind the overturned cart. Ori added her own brief message, simpler than her brother's but no less heartfelt, saying only that she wanted to be brave like Elena when she grew up, and that she hoped the council would always send help quickly whenever anyone needed it. The recording ended, and for a long moment nobody in the chamber spoke. Several delegates who had approached the entire session with cautious skepticism found themselves visibly moved by the simple honesty of the children's words. Sorn sat very still, his earlier reservations tempered by the undeniable humanity, in the broadest sense of the word, reflected in what he had just heard. Doran thanked the council for allowing him to share the recording, then returned quietly to his seat, satisfied that he had given voice to something the formal proceedings alone could never have fully expressed. Grace Fenwick used the moment to steer the conversation toward practical next steps, proposing a preliminary timeline for establishing the Joint Defense Committee and inviting delegates to submit their questions and concerns in writing over the following weeks, rather than attempting to resolve every detail within a single session. Several delegates expressed appreciation for this measured approach, recognizing that meaningful policy changes required careful deliberation rather than hasty decisions made in the emotional aftermath of a dramatic event. A delegate from a smaller member species called the Threnal, who had remained largely silent throughout the session, rose to ask a final question before the meeting concluded. She asked whether humanity would be willing to extend similar rapid response support to other smaller, less protected outposts throughout the Alliance, not only in moments of dramatic crisis, but as part of an ongoing commitment to mutual protection. Daniel answered without hesitation, affirming that this was precisely the kind of partnership his crew, and he believed the broader human delegation as well, would welcome wholeheartedly. Grace Fenwick nodded in agreement, noting that discussions along these exact lines had already begun informally among various human representatives stationed across the Alliance, each of them recognizing the same troubling pattern of delayed response that had nearly cost the Ilvanar outpost so dearly. She promised the Threnal delegate that these considerations would be incorporated directly into the framework for the Joint Defense Committee moving forward, ensuring that smaller and more vulnerable member worlds received the same level of protection as larger, more established ones. As the session finally adjourned, delegates lingered in small groups throughout the chamber, continuing conversations that had begun during the formal proceedings. Phelan found herself approached by several researchers from other species, all eager to discuss her findings in greater detail and explore how similar studies might be conducted regarding other member species whose full history and capability remained poorly understood by the wider council. She left the chamber that evening, feeling that her work had contributed to something far larger than she had originally anticipated when she first began digging through humanity's overlooked historical archives. In the weeks that followed the emergency council session, word of the Joint Defense Committee proposal spread quickly across the Alliance, generating discussion among member species who had never before considered humanity as a serious partner in matters of protection and security. Grace Fenwick worked tirelessly alongside a small team of council administrators, refining the framework for the committee to ensure it addressed the concerns raised by cautious delegates like Sorn, while preserving the speed and flexibility that had proven so vital during the crisis at the Ilvanar outpost. Sorn, true to his methodical nature, spent considerable time reviewing every detail of the proposed framework, consulting with military analysts from several member species to assess the potential risks and benefits of formalizing humanity's role within the Council's defense structure. Though he remained naturally cautious, his private conversations with Grace Fenwick revealed a growing respect for the transparency humanity had shown throughout the entire process, a stark contrast to his initial fears following the rescue operation. Phelan Rowe continued her research in the months that followed, expanding her original report into a broader study, examining how various member species might benefit from closer collaboration with humanity across other areas beyond defense, including emergency response, exploration, and disaster relief. Her work gained significant attention within the Council's research division, and she found herself invited to present her findings at increasingly prestigious gatherings, her once obscure area of study suddenly at the center of galactic conversation. Doran remained in close contact with Elena during this period, sending regular updates about the outpost's continued recovery and the steady return of normal life to its corridors and gardens. Tamsil and Ori, still processing the frightening events of that day, found comfort in drawing pictures of the Horizon Wake arriving to help, pinning their artwork proudly to the walls of the outpost's small school, a colorful reminder of the day help had finally come when it mattered most. Elena requested and received a formal reassignment to continue serving as the primary diplomatic liaison for the outpost, a decision that surprised some of her colleagues, but felt entirely natural to her, given the deep connections she had formed during her time there. She returned to the outpost several weeks later, greeted warmly by Ambry, who insisted on preparing another meal to celebrate her return, and by Tamsil and Ori, who proudly showed her their drawings before dragging her outside to see the newly repaired gardens. Daniel and his crew aboard the Horizon Wake resumed their regular patrol duties, though their reputation had shifted considerably following the widely publicized events at the outpost. Other vessels along their patrol routes began requesting closer coordination, and several smaller outposts reached out directly, hoping to establish faster communication channels with the Horizon Wake in case similar emergencies arose in the future. Daniel welcomed these requests, seeing them as a natural and positive outcome of the trust his crew had earned through their actions. Priya found herself fielding an increasing number of communications from various outposts and trade vessels, all eager to establish the kind of direct emergency contact that had proven so vital during the crisis. She worked with Grace Whitfield to develop a more formalized protocol for handling these requests, ensuring that the Horizon Wake could respond efficiently to genuine emergencies without becoming overwhelmed by the surge of new attention following their widely known rescue operation. Marcus Bell, who had led the boarding team during the operation, found himself reflecting often on the calm, controlled nature of that mission, grateful that the entire operation had concluded without unnecessary harm to anyone involved, including the raiders themselves. He spoke with younger crew members about the importance of restraint and careful judgment even in high-pressure situations, using the outpost rescue as an example of how decisive action and thoughtful control could work together effectively when guided by clear priorities. Oliver Bright, the skilled pilot who had guided the Horizon Wake through the debris field during their approach, continued refining his navigational techniques, occasionally training alongside pilots from other member species who had expressed curiosity about human piloting methods following the widely discussed rescue operation. He found these exchanges rewarding, appreciating the opportunity to share knowledge and build genuine connections with colleagues from different backgrounds who had once viewed humanity with uncertain distance. 3 months after the initial crisis, the Council formally approved the Joint Defense Committee, establishing a structured framework that combined human rapid response capability with the Council's broader diplomatic oversight, ensuring that future emergencies could be addressed swiftly while still maintaining appropriate accountability. Grace Fenwick stood before the assembled delegates as the final vote was tallied, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as the measure passed with a wide margin of support, including a notably thoughtful endorsement from Sorn himself. The committee's first official meeting brought together representatives from multiple species, including Daniel, who attended as humanity's primary military liaison, and Doran, who had been invited to share the Ilvanar perspective on the value of rapid, trustworthy defense partnerships. The meeting proceeded with a spirit of genuine collaboration, delegates discussing practical logistics and communication protocols with an enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible during the tense, uncertain days immediately following the crisis. Elena, watching a recorded summary of the meeting from her post at the outpost, felt a quiet swell of pride, knowing that her simple, urgent decision to reach out for help during a moment of crisis had ultimately contributed to a lasting shift in how humanity was understood and valued across the entire alliance. She thought back to that terrifying night in the corridor, holding Tamsil and Ori close, and felt grateful that everything had led to this moment of genuine partnership rather than continued fear and suspicion. Phelan Rowe published her expanded research findings as a comprehensive study, widely distributed across the Council's academic network, offering member species a deeper understanding of humanity's complex history and the values that continued to guide their actions, even in the most difficult circumstances. Her work became a foundational resource for other species, seeking to better understand their newest and most unexpectedly capable ally, helping to replace lingering uncertainty with genuine curiosity and respect. Sorn, once humanity's most vocal skeptic within the Council, eventually became one of the Joint Defense Committee's steadiest supporters, having witnessed firsthand the careful, principled manner in which humanity approached its expanded role within the Alliance. He remarked privately to Grace Fenwick that his initial caution had never truly been about distrust of humanity itself, but rather a natural response to encountering something unfamiliar and powerful, without fully understanding its underlying nature. Now, with greater understanding, his caution had transformed into genuine respect. Ambry, watching the changes unfold from her quiet corner of the outpost, often spoke to her grandchildren about the importance of courage and compassion working together, using Elena and Daniel's actions as a gentle lesson about how true strength revealed itself not through force alone, but through a willingness to act selflessly for the sake of others. Tamzil and Ori listened intently, their earlier fear long since replaced by admiration and a deep sense of gratitude toward the people who had kept them safe during the darkest hours of that frightening day. As the months continued to pass, the story of the outpost rescue became something of a defining moment in the broader history of humanity's relationship with the Galactic Council, referenced often in discussions about trust, partnership, and the true nature of protection. Newer delegates joining the Council years later would still hear the story during their orientation, a reminder that first impressions could be misleading, and that genuine understanding often required witnessing character revealed through action, rather than assumption formed from a distance. Daniel, reflecting on everything that had transpired during a quiet moment aboard the Horizon Wake as it resumed its familiar patrol route, found himself thinking not of the recognition or the shifting political landscape that followed the crisis, but simply of the relief he had felt upon receiving confirmation that Elena, Tamzil, Ori, and every other resident of the outpost had made it through safely. That relief, more than any formal acknowledgement from the Council, remained the truest measure of what the mission had accomplished. Elena, standing in the outpost's newly restored garden months later, watched Tamzil and Ori chase each other playfully among the blossoming plants, their laughter carrying easily through the peaceful afternoon air. Ambry sat nearby, watching with quiet contentment, occasionally glancing toward Elena with a warm, grateful smile. In that peaceful moment, far removed from the chaos and fear of that first terrifying night, Elena understood clearly that the true legacy of everything that had happened was not found in council votes or formal committees, but in simple, quiet moments like this one, made possible because someone had chosen to answer a call for help without hesitation, and because an entire community had chosen afterward to build trust, rather than fear, from what they had witnessed together. 6 months after the Joint Defense Committee's formal establishment, its systems faced a genuine test when a distress signal reached the Council from a distant mining colony, operated by a small, technologically modest species called the Wren. The colony had suffered a sudden structural collapse following an unstable mining operation, trapping dozens of workers deep beneath the surface with limited air and no means of escape. Under the old system, such a distress call might have taken days to receive any meaningful response, buried beneath layers of jurisdictional debate, exactly like the crisis at the Ilvanar outpost had once been. This time, the signal reached the Joint Committee's newly established rapid communication network within minutes, automatically alerting both Council oversight officials and the nearest available response vessel simultaneously. That vessel happened to be the Horizon Wake, still patrolling nearby trade routes under Daniel's steady command. Within the hour, his crew had mobilized alongside a coordinated support team from 3 other member species, each contributing specialized equipment suited to the specific challenges of a structural collapse, rather than the raider engagement they had faced before. Grace Whitfield coordinated closely with engineers from the Merilith delegation, whose expertise in stabilizing unstable structures proved invaluable as the joint team worked to reach the trapped miners safely. Marcus led a combined rescue team, drawing on lessons learned from his experience during the outpost operation, though this crisis demanded patience and careful technical precision rather than the swift tactical action that had characterized their earlier mission. Priya maintained constant communication with the trapped miners, offering reassurance and steady updates throughout the long, tense hours of the rescue effort. The operation succeeded, with every trapped miner brought safely to the surface after nearly 14 hours of careful, coordinated effort. News of the successful rescue spread quickly, reinforcing the value of the Joint Committee's rapid response framework and silencing many of the remaining doubts that had lingered among more cautious delegates following the committee's initial establishment. Sorn, watching the operation's outcome unfold through official reports, remarked to Grace Fenwick that this quieter, more technical rescue had done as much to validate the committee's purpose as the dramatic events at the Ilvanar outpost ever had. Word of the mining colony rescue eventually reached Doran, who shared the news with Elena during one of their regular conversations. Elena felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the systems born from her own desperate decision months earlier were now saving lives across the Alliance in situations far removed from the crisis that had started it all. She mentioned this to Ambry during a quiet afternoon in the outpost's garden, and the elderly woman smiled knowingly, telling Elena that true acts of courage rarely stayed contained to a single moment, but instead tended to ripple outward, touching lives their originators might never even learn about. Illyra Voss, the correspondent who had first brought the outpost story to wider attention, returned to cover the mining colony rescue as well, drawing a direct line between the two events in her reporting and helping the broader public understand how far the Alliance's approach to crisis response had evolved in such a short time. Her follow-up report featured interviews with several of the rescued Wren miners, who spoke with heartfelt gratitude about the speed and coordination of the response that had saved their lives, echoing sentiments Ambry and the other outpost residents had expressed months earlier. Phelan Rowe used both incidents as central case studies in a new research initiative she launched within the Council's academic division, focused specifically on understanding how diverse member species could combine their unique strengths most effectively during joint operations. She invited researchers from multiple species to contribute their own findings, building a growing body of knowledge that promised to improve cooperation across the Alliance for years to come. Her early work, once viewed as a curious but minor academic pursuit, had grown into a respected and influential field of study within the Council's broader research community. As the first anniversary of the outpost rescue approached, Doran organized a small gathering at the outpost to mark the occasion, inviting Elena, Daniel, and several members of his crew to join the Ilvanar community in a quiet celebration of resilience and gratitude. Elena arrived first, greeted warmly by Ambry, Tamsil, and Ori, the two children now noticeably taller and more confident than the frightened pair she had guided through smoke-filled corridors a year earlier. They proudly showed her the garden they had helped replant themselves, a small but meaningful act of renewal following the destruction they had witnessed. Daniel arrived shortly after, along with Priya, Grace Whitfield, and Marcus, all of them receiving a warm welcome from the outpost residents, who remembered their contributions vividly, despite the passage of time. The gathering was simple and unhurried, filled with shared meals, quiet conversation, and the kind of genuine warmth that formal council proceedings could never fully replicate. Vesa, now serving as the outpost's senior operations coordinator following his steady leadership during the crisis, offered a heartfelt toast, thanking everyone present for the role they had played in ensuring the outpost's survival and continued recovery. Doran rose to speak as well, reflecting on how far the relationship between humanity and the wider council had come since that frightening day. He spoke of the Joint Defense Committee's growing success, of the mining colony rescue that had followed, and of the countless quieter improvements in cooperation and trust that had spread throughout the Alliance in the months since. He raised his glass toward Elena and Daniel, thanking them not merely for their actions during the crisis itself, but for the patience and honesty they had shown afterward, qualities that had allowed a single dramatic moment to grow into something far more lasting and meaningful. As the evening wound down, Elena found herself standing beside Daniel near the edge of the newly restored garden, watching Tamsil and Ori chase fireflies through the soft evening light, while Ambry and the other elders looked on with quiet contentment. Daniel remarked that he rarely allowed himself to reflect on the broader impact of his crew's actions, preferring instead to focus simply on the next mission, the next person who might need help. But standing here, watching this peaceful scene unfold, he admitted that moments like this reminded him exactly why that instinct to answer every call for help without hesitation, mattered so deeply. Elena agreed quietly, her gaze following the children's laughter through the garden. She thought back to the council chamber, to Soren's early skepticism, to Phelan's careful research, and to the slow, steady process that had transformed a single moment of crisis into a lasting partnership built on genuine understanding rather than fear. She realized that the true measure of that transformation was not found in any committee charter or formal vote, but in this simple, unguarded moment of peace, made possible by everyone who had chosen, in their own way, to answer when someone else needed help the most. And as the stars began to appear over the outpost, casting their soft light across the garden below, she felt certain that this quiet, hard-won peace was worth every difficult step it had taken to achieve.